gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled up to the Airbnb. It was a small, isolated cabin nestled deep in the redwood forest, hours north of San Francisco. I'd booked it for a solo writing retreat, craving the quiet and the chance to finally finish my manuscript. The nearest town was a good 30-minute drive, and cell service had dropped off about 10 miles back. Perfect, I'd thought, no distractions. The cabin itself was charming enough, rustic, with a wide front porch and a surprisingly comfortable-looking hammock. I hauled my suitcase and laptop inside, noting the thick, ancient trees that pressed in closely on all sides, blocking out most of the late afternoon sun. As dusk settled, a heavy fog rolled in, swallowing the trees and the distant hills. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. I cooked a simple dinner, ate by the light of a single lamp, and then settled onto the couch with my laptop. The isolation that had felt so appealing earlier was starting to feel a little oppressive. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind through the redwoods made me jump. I told myself it was just nerves, the quiet getting to me. Then I heard it, a faint clink from the back of the house, near the kitchen window. I froze, straining my ears. Nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator. I dismissed it as imagination, probably a branch hitting the glass. A few minutes later, a soft thud came from the front porch, like something heavy being set down. My heart started to beat a little faster. I walked quietly to the living room window, pulling back a corner of the curtain. The fog was so thick I could barely see my hand in front of my face, let alone anything on the porch. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer perhaps. But then came the undeniable sound of footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate, moving towards the front door. My breath hitched. This wasn't an animal. Someone was out there. I backed away from the window, pressing myself against the wall, my mind racing. Who could it be? The nearest neighbor was miles away. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the door. I heard a soft click, then a gentle turn of the doorknob. It was locked, thank God, but they were trying to get in. I stood there, paralyzed, listening to the subtle scraping sound of something being inserted into the lock. They were picking it. A wave of pure terror washed over me. I had to do something. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a thick, decorative iron poker from beside the fireplace, and held it tight, my knuckles white. The lock clicked definitively. My stomach dropped. The doorknob slowly, silently began to turn. I heard a soft whoosh as the seal broke. The door was opening. I braced myself, my heart hammering against my ribs. The door swung inward a few inches. A dark silhouette, broad-shouldered and faceless in the gloom, started to push its way through the gap. I didn't think, I just reacted. With a guttural scream I didn't know I had in me, I lunged forward, swinging the iron poker with all my might. It connected with a sickening thud and a grunt of pain. The figure staggered backward, scrambling, and I heard a heavy fall onto the porch. Without a second thought, I slammed the door shut, fumbling frantically with the deadbolt. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely push the bolt into place. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, listening. Silence. Just the pounding of my own blood in my ears. I stayed awake all night, huddled in the corner of the living room, the poker still clutched in my hand. At the first hint of dawn, a faint gray light piercing the fog, I snatched my car keys and practically dove out the door, not even bothering to pack. I sped down the gravel road, not stopping until I hit the main highway and found a diner with cell service. I called the police. They sent a couple of deputies out to the cabin. They found a crowbar on the porch, dropped in the dirt near the steps. And then, leaning against the side of the house, partially obscured by a bush, was a small, rusted toolbox. Inside, neatly arranged, were various lock-picking tools, a roll of duct tape, and a coil of thin rope. The deputy, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, looked at me gravely. "Ma'am," she said, "looks like you interrupted something. They didn't just stumble upon your place. Someone knew you were here. They had plans." The realization hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't been chosen at random. Someone had been watching, and I still didn't know who or why. The quiet of the redwoods now felt like a predatory whisper, a constant reminder of how close I'd come to disappearing without a trace. It was 2 years ago, almost to the day, that this happened. I was a freelance writer back then, struggling to hit a tight deadline for a major project. The city noise was just too much, so I decided to book an Airbnb cabin deep in the mountains. I figured a change of scenery and some absolute quiet would do wonders for my productivity. The photos looked charming, all rustic and cozy, and the lack of cell service was actually a plus, no distractions. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, hoping to get a solid weekend of work in before Monday. The last stretch of road to the cabin was a winding, narrow dirt path, surrounded by dense forest. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, I saw him. A man, dressed in dark clothes and a cap, standing perfectly still by the roadside, facing away from me, looking out into the trees. He didn't move as my car approached, but as I passed him, I caught a glimpse of him in my rearview mirror. He was looking directly at my car now, and then just as quickly he was gone. Vanished. I remember feeling a shiver, an odd sense of unease, but I chalked it up to the isolation and the long drive. Probably just a local, I told myself. I pulled up to the cabin, which was a little older and more secluded than the pictures suggested. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Inside, it was warm enough, but as I set my bags down in the living room, I noticed one of the curtains on the main window wasn't fully drawn. A sliver of the darkening woods was visible. I walked over to close it properly, and that's when I saw him again. The same man, standing beneath a tall pine tree just outside, his back to the cabin, facing the deeper woods. He wasn't moving, just standing there. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled the curtain shut, so fast it almost came off the rail. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it away, but the knot of unease in my stomach tightened. As I went to the kitchen to boil some water for tea, I noticed the back door was slightly ajar, not locked. I quickly secured it, but a faint, damp, earthy smell, not quite of the forest, seemed to cling to the air inside the cabin. It was unsettling. Later that night, the rain started. It hammered against the roof and windows, a relentless drumming that should have been soothing, but only amplified my growing anxiety. I was trying to work in the living room, the rhythmic tapping of my keyboard the only other sound. Then I heard it, a faint creak, distinct from the storm, coming from upstairs. It sounded like a floorboard, giving way under weight. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keys. I told myself it was just the old house settling, or maybe the wind. But then it happened again, clearer this time, a soft, deliberate footstep. My breath hitched. A few minutes later, a dull thud echoed from the staircase, as if something heavy had been gently placed down. This wasn't the wind. Someone was in the cabin. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I slowly, silently reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold it steady. I crept to the entrance of the living room, peering into the shadows where the staircase began. A tall, dark silhouette slowly emerged from the gloom. It was him, the man from the road, the man from the trees. He held something in his hand, a long, stick-like object that glinted faintly in the dim light. He made no sound, just moved with a terrifying slowness, directly towards where I stood. Adrenaline surged through me. Without thinking, I grabbed the heavy desk lamp from the coffee table and hurled it at him with all my might, then lunged for the nearest window. The man let out a low, guttural growl, sidestepping the lamp. Just as my hand touched the window latch, he was there. His hand shot out and grabbed my ankle, pulling me back with incredible force. I hit the floor hard, my knee slamming against the edge of the coffee table. He was on me in an instant, a heavy weight, his hand clamping over my mouth, the other reaching for something to bind me. I thrashed wildly, desperately, my fingernails raking across his face. He grunted in pain, his grip momentarily loosening. It was all I needed. I used every ounce of my remaining strength, driving my knee up, hard, into his groin. He let out a strangled cry, his body recoiling. I scrambled to my feet, half crawling, half stumbling towards the front door. The old, rusty bolt was stiff, but I yanked it open with a desperate surge of strength and burst out into the pouring rain. I ran blindly, slipping in the mud, down the winding dirt path towards the main road. I could hear his enraged shouts and the heavy thud of his footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I ran for what felt like an eternity, soaked to the bone, my lungs burning, until I saw headlights approaching in the distance. I staggered into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically, screaming for help. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed into the passenger seat, sobbing. The police arrived quickly. They found the cabin's back door visibly forced open, tools scattered on the floor. Fingerprints led them to a local man, known for petty theft and occasional break-ins in isolated properties. But what truly chilled me to the bone was what they found in his squalid, makeshift camp in the woods nearby. A crude, hand-drawn map of the Airbnb cabin, detailing every room, even my bedroom. And next to it, scrawled on a torn piece of paper, were my car's license plate number and the exact time of my arrival at the cabin. He hadn't just been a local passing by. He had been waiting. I was never truly alone from the moment I turned onto that dirt road. He had seen me coming, had observed me, and had planned it all. The quiet solitude I craved had almost become my tomb. It was a Wednesday, a day I'll never forget. I drove to the Airbnb, and by the time I arrived, it was completely dark. It was located outside a remote town in Northern California, surrounded only by dense forest. I had booked it for the weekend, hoping to finish my thesis in peace and quiet, so the place seemed perfect. The house description called it secluded and close to nature, which sounded romantic. But as I turned onto the unlit gravel path, I realized it wasn't romantic at all. It was truly desolate. I parked the car and dragged my luggage to the porch. It was pitch black, and only my phone's flashlight illuminated the ground. When I opened the door, a stale, damp smell hit me, along with a faint hint of mildew. I put my things down, leaving my suitcase in the center of the living room. The house looked much older than the photos, with old-fashioned dark wooden furniture and a faint smoky odor that made me uneasy. I turned on every light I could find and pulled back all the curtains, wanting to make the house feel brighter. Outside, it was completely dark. I couldn't hear anything but the rustling of leaves in the wind. I had planned to buy some groceries, but I was too tired, so I just made some instant noodles and sat down to work. Time passed, and I was completely absorbed in my thesis until a distinct sound suddenly came from outside. It sounded like something being dragged across the gravel, a scraping, grating noise. My head shot up, my heart pounding. I told myself it was the wind. It had to be the wind blowing something. I picked up my phone, its faint light illuminating the living room. I tried to calm myself, turning back to my computer screen. But just then, another faint click came from outside the window, like someone trying to turn a doorknob. My breath hitched. I slowly stood up and crept to the window, only daring to peek through the gap in the curtains. Outside was just darkness, with tree shadows swaying in the wind, looking like giant specters. I stared for several minutes, seeing nothing, and no more sounds came from outside the house. I reassured myself that it must be an old house making noises, or maybe an animal. I forced myself to go back to my computer, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. The night deepened. I started to feel thirsty, so I got up to get some water from the kitchen. As I reached the kitchen doorway, I suddenly stopped. I clearly remembered pulling back all the curtains in the living room when I entered, but now, the only window in the kitchen had its curtain drawn tightly shut. My whole body stiffened, and goosebumps prickled my skin. I swore I hadn't touched that curtain. I tried to compose myself, taking one slow step after another towards the window, then yanked the curtain open. Outside, it was still pitch black, but my gaze fell on the dirt beneath the windowsill. There were several clear shoe prints, leading directly into the woods behind the house. The prints were fresh, looking as if someone had just been standing there. My stomach lurched. This was definitely not the wind or an animal. Someone had been here. Panic set in. My hands trembling, I pulled out my phone, wanting to call the police, but I found I had no signal. I held my phone as high as I could, pacing back and forth in the house, but there was still no signal. My heart sank. I was alone, in a remote Airbnb, with no phone service. Only one thought ran through my mind. I had to get out of here. I grabbed my car keys and wallet and rushed towards the door. The moment my hand touched the doorknob, a loud bang came from outside. Bang! It sounded like someone had slammed against the door. My scream caught in my throat. I could hear the door vibrating, and the force from outside continued to batter it. I pressed against the door, holding it with all my might. The lock rattled, click-clack, and I could feel the door panel slowly caving in. I took a step back, desperately looking around. My gaze fell on a heavy fire poker by the living room fireplace. Without thinking, I rushed over, grabbed it, and ran back to the door. Just then, with a creaking sound, the lock broke, and a dark silhouette burst in. I couldn't make out his face. He was tall and dressed in dark clothes. The moment he rushed in, I instinctively raised the fire poker and swung it with all my might at the dark figure. I heard a grunt, and the figure recoiled a step. I seized the opportunity and, like a madwoman, dashed past his side and out the door. I didn't dare look back, only knew to sprint towards the garage. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me. He was chasing me. I reached the car, my hands shaking so much I couldn't get the key into the ignition. The footsteps behind me grew closer. I could even feel his heavy breathing. I finally got the key in and furiously started the car. The engine roared loudly. The moment I shifted into reverse, the car door was yanked open, and a large hand reached in and grabbed my arm. The hand was incredibly strong, its nails practically digging into my flesh. I screamed and slammed my foot on the accelerator. The car shot out like a wild horse, dragging the person with it for a couple of steps before he was flung off. I saw him fall to the ground in the rearview mirror, unmoving. I didn't stop, and I didn't look back. I floored the accelerator, speeding all the way until I drove out of that dark path and saw the faint lights of the highway in the distance. I pulled over at the nearest gas station, trembling uncontrollably as I called the police. They arrived quickly and took me back to the Airbnb. The house was a mess. The living room door was completely destroyed, and the door frame was cracked. The police searched the house and found a crowbar under the kitchen window, with my fingerprints on it. They found more footprints around the house and some scattered tools, as if someone had surveyed the area in advance. Later, the police told me that there had been a few previous break-ins in that area, but never anything like what happened to me, where the intruder directly broke through the door. They also said that the swing I made with the fire poker probably saved my life. The person was never found, but I know he was there, he was real. I'll never forget that night, the fear of being tracked and attacked, and the desperation of struggling for survival alone in the wilderness. Since then, I've never stayed alone in any remote place. Every time night falls, I always remember that shattered door and the large hand that gripped my arm. Some places truly aren't as safe as they seem. What do you think?